tea-drinking aristocrat who refused to be a queen, yet ended up being called the most dangerous woman in Europe by Adolf Hitler himself because of your unbreakable will. Born into the uppermost echelons of the British aristocracy, yet distinctly removed from the suffocating gilded cage of royalty, the Honorable Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon spent her formative years in an atmosphere of privileged, chaotic freedom that would later define her stubborn resistance to the crown. Her childhood was not passed within the sterile, hushed corridors of a royal palace where children were seen and not heard, but rather amidst the rugged, mist-shrouded beauty of Glamis Castle in Scotland, an ancestral seat teeming with dark history, ancient legends, and Duchess, and persistent rumors of ghosts, like the Grey Lady haunting the stone corridors. It was a place where the very walls seemed to whisper the secrets of centuries past to a young girl with a vivid imagination. As the 9th of 10 children born to the Earl and Countess of Strathmore, Elizabeth was afforded a degree of liberty that was almost unheard of for young women of her station in the rigid Edwardian era. She was not raised to be a silent ornament or a political pawn. She was encouraged to be mischievous, intelligent, and fiercely independent, free from the prying eyes of equerries and the rigid schedules that suffocated her future husband. This upbringing, filled with practical jokes, outdoor adventures on the windswept Scottish moors, and a lack of rigid protocol, fostered a spirited personality that could charm almost anyone from the grim-weathered estate workers to the high society matriarchs of London. By the time she entered the dazzling social whirl of the 1920s, as a debutante, she was not merely looking for a husband to secure her future. She was embracing a life of vitality and social influence on her own terms. She became a celebrated beauty of her era, a quintessential bright young thing, who danced the Charleston until dawn and navigated the intricate social ladders with an effortless grace that masked a steely, almost masculine resolve. However, beneath the layers of tulle, the garden parties, and the endless balls, lay a young woman who deeply, almost aggressively, cherished her autonomy. She saw the royal family not as a pinnacle to be reached, but as a golden cage to be avoided at all costs. Unlike many of her peers who fantasized about wearing a tiara, Elizabeth possessed a rare and terrifying understanding of what royal duty actually entailed: a life of relentless scrutiny, enforced silence, and absolute servitude to the state. She had absolutely no desire to trade her joyous, unfettered existence for the crushing weight of the monarchy, a sentiment that would become the central conflict of her early adulthood. This chapter sets the stage for the defining struggle of her youth, a battle between her heart's potential capacity for love and her mind's terrifying realization of what marrying a prince would actually cost her personal freedom. Before we continue with this epic saga of the woman who single-handedly saved the House of Windsor, please take a brief moment to support our channel. If you are enjoying this deep dive into history, please hit that like button. It truly helps the algorithm share these stories with more history lovers like you. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming documentaries on the hidden figures who shaped our world. And finally, share this video with a friend or family member who loves royal history as much as you do. Your support allows us to continue researching and producing high-quality documentaries. Now, let's return to the courtship that almost didn't happen. The course of British history was irrevocably altered by the persistent, almost desperate adoration of a shy, stammering prince for a woman who repeatedly and firmly told him no. Prince Albert, known affectionately to his family as Bertie, was the second son of the formidable King George V, a man who ruled his family with the same terrifying naval discipline he applied to his ships. Bertie was a figure of deep vulnerability, physically frail, prone to outbursts of temper born of frustration. and plagued by a debilitating speech impediment that made every public engagement a torture. Yet when he met Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon at a dance, he saw in her something he had been starved of his entire life: unconditional warmth, strength, and a spark of genuine joy that stood in stark contrast to his own gloomy, disciplined upbringing. He fell deeply, irrevocably in love, seeing her not just as a wife, but as a savior who could make him whole. However, the narrative of their courtship is not a simple fairy tale of a prince sweeping a commoner off her feet. It is a dramatic story of a woman fighting tooth and nail to preserve her identity against the overwhelming machinery of the state. Elizabeth rejected his marriage proposals not once, but twice, a scandalous hesitation in an era where refusing a prince was unthinkable. This was not a coy game of hard to get. It was a genuine expression of existential fear. In her own correspondence, she confessed she was afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I feel I really ought to. She watched the royal family from a close distance, observing the rigid, stifling protocols that governed their every breath, and she recoiled. She knew that marrying Bertie meant marrying the institution, the firm, and subjecting herself to a lifetime of public service that she had never courted. The drama of this chapter lies in the intense tension between Bertie's dogged persistence he famously declared to his mother, Queen Mary, that he would marry no one else, and Elizabeth's terrified realization that her freedom was being besieged by the very man she was growing to love. It highlights the profound irony that the woman who would eventually become the monarchy's greatest strength and most staunch traditionalist initially tried to run away from it with every fiber of her being, only relenting when she realized her rejection was breaking the heart of a man she had grown to respect deeply. When Elizabeth finally accepted Bertie's third proposal, she did so under the firm, albeit naive, belief that they had secured a quiet, peripheral life far from the burden of the crown. Upon their marriage in Westminster Abbey, they became the Duke and Duchess of York, a title that carried immense prestige, but, crucially, little political responsibility compared to the heir, the glamorous Prince Edward. For a brief golden decade, Elizabeth's gambles seemed to have paid off spectacularly. They established a domestic idol at 145 Piccadilly in London, a home that was decidedly unroyal in its warmth, clutter, and informality. Here, amidst the chaos of playful corgis and scattered toys, they raised their two daughters, Princess Elizabeth Lilibet and Princess Margaret Rose, in an environment that prioritized family affection, bedtime stories, and games of charades over dynastic duty, a stark, deliberate contrast to the cold Victorian upbringing Bertie had endured. The public fell in love with them, not as rulers, but as the ideal family, a relatable mirror of upper-class stability that seemed attainable and wholesome. Elizabeth thrived in this role. She was the smiling Duchess, a supportive wife who could smooth over Bertie's awkwardness with a well-timed joke and charm foreign dignitaries without the crushing pressure of sovereignty. She meticulously crafted an image of domestic bliss, unaware that this very popularity was preparing her for a role she never wanted. This period represents the calm before the storm, a fleeting era of happiness where Elizabeth could still convince herself that she had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of royal life, securing love and status without the ultimate sacrifice of the throne. It was a happy illusion, a bubble of peace that was destined to be shattered by forces completely out of her control. Lurking in the shadow of the king's impending death and the Prince of Wales's chaotic personal life, the delicate, protected ecosystem of the York family was violently disrupted by the arrival of one woman who threatened to destroy the entire monarchy, Wallis Simpson, following the death of the strict patriarch, King George V, in early 1936. Bertie's older brother ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII, charismatic, modern, and dangerously reckless. David, as he was known to the family, was obsessed with the twice-divorced American socialite Wallis Simpson. For Elizabeth, Wallis was not merely an unsuitable match. She was a chaotic force of nature, a moral vacuum that threatened the very foundations of the institution Elizabeth had reluctantly married into. This chapter of her life is defined by a rapidly growing anxiety and a visceral, almost primal distaste for Mrs. Simpson. It was a clash of civilizations: the dutiful, aristocratic Scottish traditionalist versus the brash, modern American iconoclast. Elizabeth, with her deep-rooted sense of duty, aristocracy, and propriety, viewed Volos as vulgar, dominating, and fundamentally dangerous to the stability of the empire. The friction was personal as well as political. Volos famously mocked Elizabeth behind her back, calling her the fat Scottish cook or cookie, ridiculing her fashion and her figure. Elizabeth, usually so controlled and polite, developed a steely, implacable hatred for the woman she blamed for destabilizing the king. She understood, perhaps sooner than the politicians or the church, that David's obsession was incompatible with the crown. She watched with horror as the king neglected state papers, ignored the advice of his ministers, and prioritized his affair over his empire. For Elizabeth, this wasn't just a constitutional crisis, it was a direct threat to her family's peace. She realized that if David fell, the burden he dropped would not disappear. It would land squarely on the shoulders of her fragile, unprepared husband, a prospect she viewed with absolute dread and a protective fury, fearing it would destroy the quiet life she had fought so hard to build. The year 1936 became known in history books as the Year of Three Kings, a chaotic, feverish period that culminated in a desperate, behind-the-scenes struggle to save a fragile prince from a destiny he feared more than death. As the abdication crisis reached its fever pitch in the cold, fog-bound December of that year, the reality of the situation crashed down upon the Duke and Duchess of York with the weight of a physical blow. Elizabeth fought frantically, using every ounce of her influence and charm to keep the status quo, hoping against hope that a solution could be found that would keep David on the throne and Bertie in the shadows where he felt safe. She knew, with the intimate, painful knowledge of a wife, that Bertie was physically and temperamentally ill-suited for kingship. He was prone to severe digestive issues, crippling anxiety attacks, and the stammer that humiliated him. To force him onto the throne of the world's largest empire, with the storm clouds of a Second World War gathering on the horizon, seemed like an act of unspeakable cruelty. This chapter captures the intense emotional turmoil behind the closed doors of their Piccadilly home, the weeping, the panic, the late-night conferences, and the overwhelming sense of doom that permeated their lives. It was a moment of suffocating pressure, where the destiny of a family was pitted against the desires of a single man. When Edward VIII finally signed the instrument of abdication to marry Volos Simpson, Elizabeth realized her fight was lost. The crown was not passed to them as a gift. It was thrust upon them like a curse. The resentment she felt in those dark, cold winter days would calcify into a lifelong grudge, not just against Volos, but against the selfish act of abdication itself, which she viewed as a dereliction of duty that betrayed her husband and forced him into an early grave. Overnight, the reluctance of the Duchess transformed into the titanium resolve of the Queen Consort, though she privately viewed the crown as a death sentence for her husband. As Bertie became King George VI, Elizabeth stepped into the role that would define the rest of her life. This transition marks one of the most remarkable psychological pivots in royal history. She buried her fear, her tears, and her anger deep beneath a veneer of professional charm and regal poise, realizing that if her husband was to survive the crushing weight of the monarchy, she had to be his strength, his shield, and his spine. She ceased to be merely a supportive wife and became a steely matriarch, the backbone of the new reign. However, this transformation was fueled by a burning, cold anger. She held Volos Simpson entirely responsible for shattering their peace and forcing an unprepared man into the merciless spotlight. She famously referred to Volos only as that woman, refusing to let the name pass her lips, effectively erasing her from the royal narrative. This chapter analyzes how Elizabeth constructed a protective fortress around the king, curating his image, managing his stress, and acting as the gatekeeper to his fragile confidence. She understood that the monarchy was fragile. The abdication had damaged public trust and shaken the foundation of the empire. To repair it, She adopted a style of majesty that was softer and more accessible than Queen Mary, yet possessed an iron core. She became the iron hand in the velvet glove, ensuring that while Bertie wore the crown, it was her will and her stability that often kept it in place. Her hatred for the ex-king and his wife was not petty spite. It was the protective rage of a woman who believed her husband was being sacrificed on the altar of his brother's selfishness. The true test of her mettle came not from family drama, but from the terrified skies over London. When the bombs of World War II began to fall, Elizabeth's refusal to leave became the stuff of legend. As the Luftwaffe rained destruction upon the capital during the Blitz, the government and the military strongly advised, begged in fact, that the Queen, the princesses, be evacuated to the safety of Canada or at least the remote countryside. Elizabeth's response was immediate, unequivocal, and searingly defiant. A declaration that would define her legacy for centuries. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." This was not merely a soundbite for the press. It was a radical act of solidarity and physical courage. Buckingham Palace itself was bombed 9 times, with one bomb falling just yards from where the king and queen were sitting, shattering windows, filling the room with the acrid smell of smoke and covering them in dust, a terrifying reminder that in total war no status could offer immunity from the rain of fire. Rather than retreating, Elizabeth expressed a grim aristocratic satisfaction, famously saying, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." By physically remaining in the line of fire, enduring the same sirens, rationing, and fear as the common people, she dissolved the barrier between the monarchy and the masses. This chapter illustrates how her physical presence in bombed-out London turned her from a distant aristocrat into a national symbol of defiance. She wore her finest clothes, her pearls and her bright colors amidst the gray rubble, not to show off, but to show respect to the victims, a gesture that was deeply appreciated by the bombed-out East Enders. She understood the power of symbols, and she turned herself into the ultimate symbol of British resistance, proving that the king and queen were suffering alongside their people, united in the face of tyranny, while the world saw the smiling queen touring the rubble behind closed doors. She was engaged in a relentless, intimate battle to guide a king who was often paralyzed by his own insecurities. King George VI's stammer was not just a speech impediment. It was a manifestation of his deep-seated anxiety about leadership and his fear of failing his people. Every radio broadcast, every public address was a mountain to climb. A potential humiliation broadcast to millions of listeners worldwide via the unforgiving BBC microphones. The glowing red light of the recording studio became a symbol of judgment, a terrifying eye that watched for his failure. Elizabeth became his coach, his therapist, and his emotional anchor. This chapter reveals her crucial role in managing his confidence, essentially curling from the shadows. She worked tirelessly with speech therapist Lionel Logue, but more importantly, she developed a subtle system of nonverbal communication with the king. During speeches, she would often stand or sit in his direct line of sight, squeezing his hand before he began or smiling to set the rhythm of his breathing. If he faltered, it was her eyes he looked for to find the strength to continue. She managed his temper, smoothed over his exhaustions, and carefully curated the people who had access to him, filtering out bad news when he was too fragile to hear it. Historians argue that without Elizabeth's relentless bolstering of his ego and her orchestration of his public image, George VI might have collapsed under the pressure of the war. She ensured the king became a figurehead of stability, hiding the trembling man behind a uniform and presenting the world with a monarch they needed to believe in, a feat of emotional labor that took a tremendous toll on her own reserves. The effectiveness of her soft power was so potent that it terrified the enemies of Britain. Adolf Hitler himself reportedly called this smiling, diminutive woman the most dangerous woman in Europe. This accolade from the fur was not based on military strategy or political command, but on her unique ability to boost British morale and unify the public. Hitler, a master of manipulation himself, understood the psychology of masses better than anyone. and he saw in Elizabeth a counterforce he could not bomb into submission. When she walked through the devastated streets of the East End, stepping over debris in her pastel coats and high heels, she projected an image of calm, unshakable continuity. She didn't cringe, she didn't weep publicly, she smiled. That smile was a weapon. It told the British people that if the Queen was not afraid, they shouldn't be either. This chapter explains the psychological warfare she waged against the Nazi propaganda machine. By connecting with the public in a way no royal had before shaking hands, listening to stories of loss, and projecting an aura of maternal protection, she cemented the bond between the people and the crown. She neutralized the German propaganda that sought to paint the royals as uncaring elites who would flee at the first sign of danger. In the darkest hours of 1940, when Britain stood alone against the might of the Axis powers, Elizabeth's indomitable spirit became a rallying point, making her, indeed, dangerous to anyone who sought to break the British will to fight. However, the victory of 1945 was followed by a slow, tragic decline. The immense weight of the war and the crown finally claimed the king's life, leaving Elizabeth a widow at the relatively young age of 51. The stress of leading the nation through its most perilous decade, combined with a lifetime of heavy smoking and the anxiety of his role, ravaged King George VI's health. He developed lung cancer and arteriosclerosis, his vitality fading visibly before the nation's eyes. His once youthful face etched with the deep lines of exhaustion. Elizabeth watched the man she had protected so fiercely wither away. Slow-motion tragedy she was powerless to stop despite her sheer force of will. When he died in his sleep at Sandringham in February 1952, Elizabeth was devastated. This chapter deals with her profound grief, which was compounded by a sudden, jarring loss of status. Overnight, she went from being the Queen, the central female figure of the empire, to the Queen Mother, a title that implied a retreat into the past and a loss of relevance. She was still full of energy, yet she was now a widow with no constitutional role. Watching her 25-year-old daughter ascend the throne she had viewed as a burden. The void in her life was immense. She retreated to Scotland, mourning deeply, and for a time seriously considered retiring from public life altogether to live as a recluse. It was a period of darkness where the smiling Duchess vanished, leaving behind a lonely woman grappling with the realization that the death sentence of the crown had finally been executed, taking her husband and leaving her behind to navigate the aftermath alone. But Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was a survivor, refusing to fade into the obscure pages of history. She reinvented herself as the Queen Mum, the beloved grandmother of the nation. Urged by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to return to public duties, she crafted a new persona that would sustain her for another half-century. She shed the austere sadness of widowhood and embraced a role that was equal parts national treasure and eccentric matriarch. This chapter showcases her triumphant return to public life. She cultivated an image of softness, chiffon dresses in pastel hues, triple strings of pearls, and a radiant smile that seemed to defy her age. She became famous for her love of horse racing, her enjoyment of a stiff gin and dubonnet before lunch, and her ability to outlast people half her age at parties. However, this fluffy grandmother image masked a continued political sharpness. She remained a staunch conservative and a fierce guardian of royal protocol, often advising her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, on matters of state and family. She knew exactly how to play the press, giving them the photo ops they wanted while maintaining an air of mysterious majesty. She proved that while she was no longer the consort, she was still the most popular member of the family, transforming herself into a living institution that bridged the gap between the severe Victorian era and the modern world. She became the nation's favorite grandmother, a figure of comfort and continuity in a rapidly changing society. In her quest for a life that was truly her own, she turned her eyes to the very edge of the world, building a private sanctuary fit for a bygone era. While visiting the north coast of Scotland, mourning her husband, she fell in love with the ruin of Barogel Castle, which she purchased and renamed the Castle of May. This was the first home she had ever owned in her own right, a symbol of her independence. This chapter explores her private world, where she restored the castle not just as a holiday home, but as a fortress against the modern world. Here she lived like a feudal queen, gazing out over the Pentland Firth, where the North Sea crashed against the cliffs with a violence that matched her own internal fortitude. She maintained a royal standard of living that harkened back to the Edwardian era, complete with a full retinue of staff, elaborate picnics on the windswept beach, and formal dinners even when dining alone. This extravagant lifestyle sometimes caused friction regarding finances. She was notorious for overspending, believing that it was the duty of the monarchy to be magnificent, and that economy was a vulgar concern. Her overdrafts were legendary, quietly subsidized by the Queen. Yet the Castle of May was essential to her spirit. It was the one place where she was not the king's wife or the Queen's mother, but simply the lady of the house. It reflects her stubborn refusal to compromise her standards and her deep need for a connection to the wild, untamed landscapes of her Scottish youth, providing her with the solace she needed to continue her public duties. As the decades passed and the monarchy was rocked by the scandals of the modern era, the Queen Mother stood as the unwavering anchor of the past. The late 20th century brought unprecedented turmoil to the House of Windsor, the divorces of her grandchildren, the fire at Windsor Castle, and the tragic death of Princess Diana. Through it all, the Queen Mother remained the staunch defender of old-world royal mystique. She struggled to understand the modern desire for openness, believing that royalty should remain distant, magical, and above the fray. This chapter analyzes her profound influence over Prince Charles, who adored her. She provided him with the unconditional love and traditional values that he often felt were missing from his relationship with his parents. She was his confidant and his link to history, often conspiring with him to uphold traditions that others wanted to modernize. For Queen Elizabeth II, her mother was a sounding board and a source of emotional support during the annus horribilis of 1992. While the younger royals provided fodder for tabloids, the Queen Mother's reputation remained Teflon-coated. The public forgave her extravagances and her old-fashioned views because she represented stability. She was the reminder of the good old days of World War II, a living monument to endurance. Her refusal to acknowledge scandals publicly, the strategy of never complain, never explain, became the bedrock upon which the family tried to steady itself during the storms of the 1990s, offering a masterclass in royal survival. By the turn of the millennium, she had achieved a status that transcended celebrity. She was 100 years of history, lived through the eyes of one extraordinary woman. Celebrating her 100th birthday in the year 2000, she became a living piece of history. She had been born when Queen Victoria was still on the throne and cars were a rarity. She lived to see the internet age and the dawn of a new millennium. This chapter focuses on the public's immense affection for her longevity. The celebrations were not just for a birthday, but for a century of British resilience. Despite facing severe physical ailments, failing eyesight, difficulty walking, and the cumulative effects of extreme old age, she refused to retreat. Her determination to stand for the national anthem, to wave to the crowds, and to perform her duties until the very end was a testament to her incredible willpower. She viewed her life as a service contract that had no expiration date. The image of the tiny centenarian woman in her bright hats became a symbol of the nation's own continuity. She was the last link to the empire, the last survivor of the titan figures of the 20th century, and the public loved her for it, with a protective intensity reserved for no one else. She embodied the idea that duty was not a choice, but a lifelong commitment, earning her a unique place in the hearts of millions. When she finally slipped away, her death marked the final curtain call for the Victorian era and cemented her legacy as the savior of the Windsors, passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 101 in 2002. Just 7 weeks after the death of her younger daughter, Princess Margaret, the Queen Mother's death marked the true end of an epoch. More than 200,000 people filed past her coffin to pay their respects, creating a sea of flowers. And a silence that spoke louder than any speech, a testament to her enduring popularity and the deep respect she commanded. The final chapter reflects on her colossal legacy. She was the reluctant queen who, through sheer force of will, charm, and steel, saved the House of Windsor from the brink of collapse in 1936. She took a shy, stammering husband and helped make him a hero. She raised a daughter who became the longest-reigning monarch in British history. And she maintained the mystique of the monarchy in an age of celebrity. Without her intervention, her strength, and her refusal to accept defeat, the British monarchy might not have survived the 20th century. She was the matriarch who stabilized the ship, proving that while she was born into the aristocracy. She earned her royalty through a lifetime of duty, leaving a void that the Windsors would never truly fill. Her life was a testament to the power of resilience, duty, and the enduring strength of a woman who refused to let history happen to her, but instead chose to shape it with her own hands.